Hey everyone, today I'm going to talk about using evidence and templates and getting students to stop doing what we call hit and run quoting. So, a lot of times, students, when they're writing a research based argumentative paper, they like to drop in quotes that support their point. For example, you may see a paragraph where they're reiterating their argument and then they put a quote in there. Uh, it should be cited, of course, but a lot of times they just throw the author in there without any context. We don't know why this person's important. We don't know the greater scope of the evidence itself. I would like to use an example from They Say, I Say, Moves That Matter in Academic Writing. And as you can see below, it says that Susan Bordeaux writes about women and dieting. Fiji is just one example. Until television was introduced in 1995, the islands had no reported cases of eating disorders. So, as you can see, the evidence here, the quote they're using, and what they're putting before it is pretty basic. It's a simple comment. Yes, they note the name of the author, but they say that she writes about women and dieting, and then they include a quote, and that's all we get. So Graff and Birkenstein call this hit and run quoting, and it's a term that they borrowed from Steve Benton, which involves, as I said earlier, dropping in a quote and then just moving on without addressing a few issues that we have. I have the quote again right here, just for reference. But the issues that this raises, first off, who is Susan Bordeaux? Why do we trust her opinion? And I'm willing to bet that plenty of English teachers and history teachers, and possibly even the science and math teachers in this group who have seen things being quoted run into this, where they just introduce a quote, they tell us who said it, but they don't give us anything that would give the author credibility. They don't do anything that would inspire trust in the reader. We're just more or less meant to take it at face value. Second thing is the second issue that this raises are these words hers. We can connect those dots. We can do a little bit of the work, but there's nothing explicitly stating other than um, the citation at the end that Susan Bordeaux wrote this. And even then, maybe this was found in Bordeaux's book, but it wasn't Bordeaux saying it. Bordeaux could be quoting somebody else. And I think another issue, of course, that this raises is how does the quote connect to my argument? Um, when someone does hit and run quoting, the reader is having to do a lot of the work. And this is something that I tell my students makes for good writing is that the writer is the one doing the work, not the reader. The writer is connecting the dots in an explicit, but not, of course, not heavy-handed way. They're doing it skillfully, but the writer does the work. The writer connects the dots for the reader. Yes, this example that I included gives a pretty basic quote and tells me that Susan Bordeaux writes about women and dieting. So they found a source and they found evidence to support what they're saying, but there is a very big disconnect because as a reader, um, this leaves me, of course, to ask the questions that I have at the bottom of this slide, but it also makes me wonder if the student even read the source. It almost makes me feel as if the student just found a book on the topic, opened it up, found something that sounded good, and included it and then cited it. So, how do we get students to fix this? How do we get them to stop doing what's called hit and run quoting? Well, we get them to do what Graff and Birkenstein recommend, which is to frame the quotation. When you frame the quote, you're showing the reader the credibility of the author being quoted, and then you're also connecting the quote to the greater argument. And as you'll see in a few moments, they're not quite diving into the reasoning. They're not quite diving into commentary. What we're going over now, fits squarely within the evidence bracket of claim evidence reasoning. So we're going to put together a better paragraph piece by piece by answering each one of the issues that I raised a second ago. So the first was, who is Susan Bordeaux? Why do we trust what she has to say? And so below, here's an example where Susan's credibility is offered up. So I'll go ahead and read this. The feminist philosopher Susan Bordeaux deplores Western media's obsession with female thinness and dieting. Her basic complaint is that an increasing number of women across the globe are being led to see themselves as fat and in need of a diet. So this not only does this tell me who Susan Bordeaux is and that we can trust what she says, she's a feminist philosopher, and she, within her work, she deplores media's obsession with thinness and dieting. But moreover, this gives credibility to the writer of the paper because this shows me that they read the source. They read the relevant parts and they know where the source is coming from. So again, they give the reader the credibility of the author, but it also gives the writer of the paper more credibility because it shows that they understand the source itself. So moving on to our next issue, which is the question, is this quote hers? As you can see with this quote below, yes, it is, because it explicitly says that Bordeaux notes that until television was introduced in 1995, the islands had no reported cases of eating disorders. It goes on from there, but you get the point. And moreover, it shows that it isn't just Bordeaux talking. Bordeaux notes this quote in a study that she did regarding dieting on the islands of Fiji. Or I'm sorry, not necessarily dieting on the islands of Fiji, but the introduction of television in Fiji in 1995. Our third issue is the question, how does this connect to my claim or argument? And you can see where the writer has taken what was presented and offering just a quick summative statement that Bordeaux's point is that the Western cult of dieting is spreading even to remote places across the globe. And so to put it together, and I'm not going to read all of this, you can, if you wish, I'll put a link to this on Google Drive and you can go through this again. But what you see here, and I've color coded it, blue for addressing the credibility of the author, white is the quoted information, and then what is in red is connecting it back to the claim. This would work really well as evidence. So if they were writing an argumentative piece and this were to fit into a paragraph, before it would come what the minor claim of that paragraph is, and then of course after would come the reasoning, or what I usually use the terms either commentary or analysis, but it's essentially the same thing. After this, commentary would come that connects the evidence presented back to the claim. Now, what's in red, again, it does answer that question. How does this connect back to the claim I'm making? But I like to see this as a jumping off point for them to begin to offer their own commentary because what's seen here is purely Susan Bordeaux. We don't see any original thought from the student. So while what's in red offers us the beginnings of a connection back to the claim and telling us why the evidence is relevant, it's still not necessarily getting into the student's own thoughts, the student's own ideas, which is what the reasoning and analysis statements that come after would do. I know that a lot of times when students write research papers, they have this tendency to find these sources and basically make their paper just an aggregate of a bunch of other people talking, and their voice kind of gets lost in there somewhere. We can see the student in the introduction, and we can see them in the conclusion, but then it just becomes them, quoting evidence and then summarizing their evidence, and it helps oftentimes telling students, that reasoning or analysis is not summary, and we've done a few exercises in my classes in the past where we had to identify the difference between an analysis statement and a summary statement, which is something that I would be more than happy to go over at a different session. And so when we're teaching this to our students, I think the best thing to do is just to present them with these three questions, which are tied back to the issues that we brought up earlier, and that is, why trust the author? What is the context of the quote? And how does it connect to your argument? It's important to tell your students that that these three questions must be answered in order for their evidence to be sufficient. And like I said earlier, I think it's good to have a slide dedicated to this, but we'll just review a few of the things I've already mentioned. To keep in mind that this covers the evidence part of the claim, evidence, reasoning format. Reasoning, or as I say in my class, often commentary or analysis, comes afterward. It may seem that the summary statement at the end of the quote, where the writer explains Bordeaux's point, stands more as a summative statement that explains the context of the quote, rather than the writer offering their own commentary. And again, we want an argumentative paper to be the student's own work. We want their voice to come out, that the examples are taking a backseat to the writer, and not vice versa. And of course, as I said a moment ago, I can offer more on teaching commentary and analysis in the future. So let's go on to using templates. And so, it may seem formulaic to encourage using templates, but they provide a helpful foundation for students to build upon. I'll provide a few examples here, but I've put a document that contains all of Graf and Birkenstein's writing templates in the NWP folder on the department drive. And I do have to say, I did not create the document. I found the document. So I was very lucky that I found it. Someone out there was able to take the templates from the book and put them in a 2-page PDF, which I think would be really awesome, provided that when it comes, when we meet in person with our students, you can just make copies and hand that to them. They can keep it in the writer's notebook and have it with them at all times whenever they're writing a rough draft. And so let's look at some of the templates now. Introducing standard views. Instead of just going, some people say, you could say something like, conventional wisdom claims that blank. Many Americans tend to believe that blank. Or I have often heard people say that blank. And before we move on, I know some of the English people may be saying, but wait a minute, that template uses I. And I'm sure there's people out there that have probably told their kids, don't use I in an essay. And I would encourage that you break them out of that. Get them to, if they're writing a paper and you want to see there to be ownership, using I is not a problem as long as it's done skillfully, of course. To introduce quotations, the author insists, according to the author, or even better, in her book title, the author maintains that, and then go from there. Then you have explaining quotations. Basically, the author is saying blank. In other words, the author believes that blank. And so when you go to the document on the drive, there's more templates that address the following situations. That is introducing something implied or assumed, introducing an ongoing debate, agreeing with the difference, and then I think what are two of my favorites, agreeing and disagreeing simultaneously, and then making concessions while still standing your ground. And so that's all I have. Thank you. Of course, if you have questions, you can email or text me. Have a good one.